June had arrived as if it meant to keep its promises. The cathedral on St. Albans Square breathed a slow perfume of lilacs and beeswax. Ribbons fluttered from carriage lamps. London performed approval with the tireless elegance of a city that likes the sound of its own bells. Inside, beneath stained glass that poured rival kingdoms of colour across the aisle, Lady Isabel Hartwell stood at the altar and practised stillness as if it were a sacrament. Her veil fell like a tame piece of weather around her shoulders. The silk of her gown whispered each time her breath forgot its training and had to be reminded. She was 23, brave in the manner of women taught that bravery must be invisible, and she was about to marry the only man who had ever made the future feel like a room with open windows. The organist tested a gentle chord. It drifted up into the rafters and came down as hope. Guests arranged themselves into tiers of certainty. Dukes and dowagers, cousins who treated gossip as a piano they had mastered. The Hartwell family pew looked like an apology polished within an inch of its life. Her father's jaw set at the angle men use when they intend to will the world into cooperation. Her mother already dabbing an embroidered handkerchief, the kind that pretends moisture is a theory. Somewhere in the back, a pack of young ladies rehearsed admiration the way soldiers rehearse formations. Isabel kept her eyes fixed on the west doors. Lord Nathaniel Greyston would come through them. He always did. Doors knew him. Rooms seemed relieved when he entered. Tall, dark-haired, laugh trained to show at precisely the moment it would heal most efficiently, he had courted Isabel without siege or spectacle, simply with the art of listening, until she found herself saying things no one had earned before. He had sent books instead of bracelets, letters instead of promises, a single wildflower on Thursdays because he refused to be predictable on Saturdays. When he asked for her hand, it had been in her father's library, with the exact humility a man wears when he means to guard something he knows he doesn't deserve. She had said yes, and the word had felt not like surrender, but like a key turned in a door that had been waiting to open. The clock at the rear of the nave made a discreet observation about the hour. A whisper passed from pew to pew, nothing unkind, only that English shiver of interest when timetable flirts with story. Isabel's maid of honour shifted her weight. The organist tested another chord and looked toward the sacristy as if music might be told to stall with dignity. Isabel swallowed. Veil, bouquet, spine. She took inventory and found all three present. The west doors did not open. It was a very small fact at first, hardly worth a second glance. Late carriages, lost gloves. London possesses 1,000 reasons for a minute to misbehave. The Dean cleared his throat in an ecumenical manner. The verger travelled 3 economical steps and arranged the aisle runner as if punctuality could be coaxed by neatness. Another minute passed, longer this time, the kind of minute that accrues witnesses. Isabel felt the first tremor enter the edges of her calm and disciplined it with a breath. Her father left the pew. He did not hurry because hurrying makes questions run faster. He went by the side aisle, the one men use when they intend to do battle without admitting it to anyone who can read lips. The murmur grew. A young marchioness leaned to her husband and whispered something with the triumph peculiar to those who suspect the universe of being a conspiracy designed for their entertainment. Isabel's mother fixed her gaze upon the altar cross and began a conversation with God of the sort only women can conduct, loving, stern, precise. At last, a sexton in a black coat too large for his narrative approached the Dean and offered a folded paper. The Dean read it, frowned in a manner that suggested theology had not prepared him for the mechanics of post. The paper was handed to Isabel's father, then to her mother, and in that little relay, the morning altered its name. Her father's mouth whitened, Her mother's hand shook. The handkerchief forgot its theory and became practice. The dean walked to Isabel with the fatal courtesy of a man obliged to announce weather inside. He bowed, too low, too kind, and offered the paper. "My lady," he said very softly, as if tone could alter content. Isabel took it. Ink can be arrogant when it is certain of being obeyed. The lines were few, the handwriting Nathaniel's. "Forgive me if you can. Do not come after me. What I do to save you from ruin. N." She read it once and felt nothing. She read it again and felt everything a second too late. The cathedral widened until she was the only upright object in a painting that had decided to weep. Somewhere, a lady gasped in a way she would later describe as delicate. Somewhere, a cousin made a small, pleased sound that he would repent at dinner. Isabel folded the note and placed it in her glove. Her hands did not shake. She had been taught that Hartwells do not fall apart in public, only in rooms with doors that remember their duty. "I will sit," she said, not because anyone demanded it, but because her knees, loyal until now, had asked for democracy. Her father's arm arrived. He guided her to a chair near the altar rail, the one reserved for brides who faint gracefully. She did not faint. She looked up at the stained glass and found the saints unhelpful. Their colours were too certain. There is a particular murmur society makes when it realizes it is inventing itself a feast. It began at the back and travelled forward, careful at first, then bolder. The dean, who had buried regiments and married people who did not mean it, addressed the congregation with professional mercy. Words about providence and postponement floated like exhausted birds. The organist, uncertain whether to sing or apologize, played a hymn softly into the carpet. Isabel rose. Her father started, but she lifted a hand and he obeyed. She walked, alone, down the aisle that had been polished for joy and now must receive its opposite. She did not bow to left or right. Heads tilted, fans hesitated. The air discovered that breath and witness are not the same craft. At the doors, she stopped and turned, because turning your back on a city is a way to ensure it will follow. Her gaze found no one in particular and everyone at once. Then she stepped into June. Outside, the heat had sharpened. Street boys paused, recognized spectacle, and pretended not to. A flower seller looked at her bouquet as if it were a question the market could not price. Her father's carriage arrived before thought could become stampede. She entered, sat, and set the bouquet on the seat opposite as one sets a guest one cannot throw out. The paper inside her glove burned like a small, efficient fire. They drove not home, but to the Hartwell townhouse for the last time. By evening, there were calls to be refused, cards left with condolences so elegant they might have been insults reheated. By morning, the papers performed their duty. Cathedral catastrophe, a duke-to-be, disappears, lady jilted, heroic composure at the altar. Heroic composure is London's favourite lie. It preserves dignity for breakfast and sells copies by lunch. Within the week, they went down to Hartwell Lodge in the countryside with the speed of people escaping a plague. The house on the downs did not ask questions. It accepted them the way earth accepts footsteps, without taking sides. Isabel took to walking at the hour the post arrived, so that the sound of wheels would not teach her heart to startle. She kept the note in a box with a key she wore around her neck, the way some women wear medals, not because the victory deserves display, but because the wound requires a boundary. Time learned its discipline. The first month became a door that closed. The first year became a corridor with no windows, and then, slowly, with one. Isabel opened a small schoolroom in the village for girls who would otherwise be taught only patience. She discovered that arithmetic obeys honesty, and that literature forgives better than any bishop. She learned the names of field birds and the precise language of weather. She taught herself that shame is a rumour and work a cure. Of Nathaniel Grayston there were only fragments, reports of ships, a rumour of Bombay, a line in a ledger connected to a tea concern that had the impertinence to behave profitably. Sometimes at dusk the downs would darken in a way that resembled a man turning to speak. Isabel would look up from her slate and refuse the resemblance its rent. On the 10th June, after the day the bells refused to ring, the lilacs along the lodge wall bloomed as if they had not been informed. Isabel closed her schoolroom early and walked to the chapel by the river where villagers marry when they choose to be brave, without audience. She sat in the last pew, hands folded, and allowed herself, no more than a minute, but a full one, to imagine the sound the bell had never made. When she stepped back into the lane, a carriage was there that did not belong to Hartwell or the village. The horses fretted as if they had been dragged across a continent and asked to behave English at once. The man who stepped down had the posture of someone who had learned to bow to weather and found it a good master. His hair had given a little ground to sun, his mouth, once fluent in laughter, had spent a decade learning contrition. He removed his hat. "Isabel," said his Grace, Nathaniel Grayston, as if 10 years were a curtain he had only now remembered how to draw back. "I have brought what I should have brought that day." In his hand was a ring, not new, not ostentatious, the gold softened by years of being carried in a pocket where regret had kept it polished. He did not offer it forward, he showed it the way a penitent shows a relic he does not presume to own. She did not faint now either. She looked at the ring and then at him, and, because she had become a woman who wished to be accurate before she wished to be dramatic, she said, with the calm of a schoolmistress asking for a definition and the explanation. "The price of it," he answered, "is the next 10 years, if you will hear them." The lilacs, traitorous, smelled of June. The river wrote its continuing sentence on the stones. Isabel felt the past arrive like weather and decided not to forgive, not yet, but to listen where she stood. London received the rumour before it received the man. It always does. Whispers slip through drawing rooms faster than carriages through gates. And within a week, the city had elected to be astonished. The Duke of Grayston is home. Porters swore they had seen him on the Southampton Road. A publisher swore he had refused to be interviewed. A milliner swore she had designed a hat specifically to be worn in his vicinity and would do so again if fate were willing to compensate her losses. Somewhere the truth travelled with less enthusiasm and more breath. Isabel did not go up at once. She had students to examine, a leaking roof over the schoolroom to coax into patience, and a village fete to arrange so the baker's wife would finally forgive the vicar's sermon about excess. 10 years had taught her the fine economy of saying no to storms that were not hers. Yet when the invitation arrived on thick cream, Lady Isabel Hartwell, you are warmly requested to attend the Whitcomb Charity Assembly in support of the Foundling Hospital. She paused. The committee had included her the way London sometimes includes the once ruined, as proof of its capacity for magnanimity. She would go, not to oblige a city, but to oblige her girls. They needed scholarships. Scholarships lived in the pockets of men who preferred to be moved by music in a ballroom. Whitcomb House glittered the way houses glitter when they intend to be forgiven for everything that occurs inside them. Chandeliers performed their starry duties. The orchestra tuned to the key of polite approval. The air smelled of peonies and the price of peonies. Isabel arrived in dusk blue silk, the modesty of the cut arguing with the dignity of the fabric until both agreed to behave. She wore no jewels. She had learned to let her posture do the work. The receiving line bent toward her with curiosity disguised as welcome, then straightened again when she passed, relieved to have survived the encounter with a legend who refused to perform. She was not thinking of him when he entered. She was thinking of the pledge list, of the way Mrs. Larkin's eldest could recite the first 20 lines of Pope with tears in her eyes, of the new maps she wanted for geography so that her girls could imagine a world where their feet might one day make claims. She had placed her glass on a side table and moved toward the terrace for air when the assembly altered. Nothing obvious, only that shift in temperature a room makes when a certain name arrives to collect its tribute. He stood at the top of the marble stair, not dramatically, simply there, as if the banister had remembered him and was relieved to be employed properly. Nathaniel wore black, the way penance wears black, without vanity, without apology, as if colour had been denied him, and he had decided to forgive colour rather than pursue it. The decades sat on him not as rust, but as weather, sun along the brow, lines learned by squinting into distances other men hire ships to report. He descended, not a duke entering his dominion, but a man entering a city he had injured and meant to heal if allowed. Eyes hunted him with courtesy. Fans changed rhythm. A dowager who had planned to be unimpressed remembered her arteries. Isabel, who had planned to be a wall, discovered she had a pulse that preferred candour. She did not move. She let him find her because some encounters must be chosen by both or not at all. He saw her, of course he did. If London had stripped him of speech, he would still have found her, with whatever senses remained to the condemned, the one woman in the room who stood as if she were not a room subject, but its measure. He came across the floor with a gait that had learned to bow to storms and to continue after bowing. When he stopped before her, the music became decor. "Lady Isabel," he said, voice lower than memory, steadier than rumour. "Your Grace," she answered, because accuracy is sometimes the only spine left. She inclined her head and then looked at him fully. "I see you found London without a map." "I have been practicing my way back for 10 years, he said. "I am grateful to have arrived before I grew old enough to be congratulated for the effort." The smile touched her mouth and fled. "The city is generous, with congratulations that cost it nothing." "Then allow me to be generous with apologies that cost me everything," he replied, too quickly, like a man who has rehearsed a line and is ashamed of needing it. He gentled. "May I ask, after your work? I have read enough to know you have given your life to it." "They give theirs to it," Isabel said, and in the simplicity of the pronoun he understood more than any pamphlet could have explained. "I supervise." He looked at her hands, not for ring or emptiness, but for the steadiness that had once steadied him across a room. "I was told you built a school from subscriptions and stubbornness." "Stubbornness was the cheaper currency," she said. "Subscriptions arrived once we gave proof." "You always preferred proof," he murmured. "And you always preferred promise," she returned, and then winced at her own accuracy. "Forgive me, that was uncharitable." "Truth rarely is," he said. He stepped aside so a pair of waltzers could pass and, without thinking, placed himself between her and the crowd so that any glance aimed like an arrow would have to travel through his history first. "I have a letter for you," he added, "not a surrogate for speech, a record, if you will permit it." "A record?" She lifted an eyebrow. "For what court?" "For yours," he said simply. "I have no other that matters." She might have laughed once at such a line. Tonight she felt its construction and found the scaffold honest. You may send it to Hartwell Lodge, she said. I am not accustomed to receiving anything of value at Whitcomb's doorstep. Then I shall deliver it myself, he said, and checked himself. With permission. With an appointment, she corrected. Tomorrow at 11, he suggested, and the speed of the proposal told her he had already planned to ask and had punished himself for the presumption in advance. Tomorrow at 2, she said, because she would not be hurried and because her girls had sums to finish and a roof to supervise. A sensible hour, he agreed, the ghost of their old ease passing between them like a friendly draught. A patroness approached to snare Nathaniel for a subscription. He allowed it. Men who need to rebuild reputations must rent themselves to causes, and he understood the arithmetic. Isabel drifted toward the terrace. Night had taken the garden in hand. Lamps held their ground like little stars paid to obey. She stepped into the cooler air and breathed the honest scent of earth. Behind her, the city purred, content with its spectacle. Lady Isabel. Lord Whitcomb joined her with a benevolent expression reserved for women who survive disgrace without suing. Might we secure your academy for next month's exhibition? The Duke has promised to match the proceeds. The Duke is generous, she said, the phrase neutral on purpose. We will bring our best readers. And our best listeners. My dear, Whitcomb chuckled, listeners do not fill the purse. They fill the world, she said, and left him to consider whether the distinction was profitable. The next morning, London remembered its trades, milk early, papers later, debts always. Isabel rode in a hired carriage to the small house near Russell Square that had agreed, for a fair rent, and a promise to hold its tongue, to be the head mistress's city address. She did not tell her mother she was going. Hartwell Lodge had learned to look east without expecting to be obeyed. She arranged the teacups not because tea would save anyone, but because dignity prefers order. At 2, precisely, a knock. Not the rap of entitlement, but the measured announcement of a man who has relearned thresholds. She opened the door to Nathaniel, hat in hand, coat brushed but not smug, eyes fatigued in the way eyes become when men have told themselves the truth, too often to pretend they enjoy the process. Thank you, he said, as if admittance were a gift and not a courtesy. He waited until she sat and only then took the opposite chair. On the table, he placed an envelope, not heavy, but dense in the way pages are when each one resists and yields, and then he removed something small from his waistcoat and set it beside the letter. The ring, not offered, present. I am not here to purchase absolution, he began, nor to explain away what cannot be explained without indictment. I am here to testify. Proceed, she said, because the word had become her weapon and her mercy. He told her of the morning of their wedding, the father who confessed a wrecked fortune, the creditors who preferred violence to arithmetic, the names of men who said marry her, and we ruin her, leave her, and we let her live. He told her of the ship he boarded not out of romance, but exile, of the years of ledger and heat, of the letter he never sent because the news inside it refused to become old enough not to wound. He spoke plainly without embroidery, and when he faltered, he did not excuse himself. She did not interrupt. She poured tea at the halfway mark because some kindnesses must be performed even while courts are in session. When he finished, the room did not rush to absolutions. It rested. Isabel looked at the ring, at the envelope, at the man who had brought both without demand. You did a cruel thing, she said at last, for reasons that call themselves kind. You left a woman to drown in a city that sells soap for such occasions. Yes, he said, and in the nakedness of the syllable she felt, for the first time, something like safety in the word we had once been. "What do you want now?" she asked. "Not marriage," he answered, and the refusal of triumph in his tone steadied her. "Not yet. Permission to repair, permission to be seen doing it, work I can be assigned, a place in the ledger of your life that is not a cost." She considered him as she would consider any risky donation, weighing the hidden clauses, evaluating the return. "Begin with the roof," she said. "It leaks. Begin with the girls' readers, half are torn. Begin with the endowment fund we pretend exists when we write our letters." "And after that?" "After that," she said, and did not smile. "We will examine your handwriting." He bowed, not the bow of a duke, but the bow of a man who recognizes that grace has an administrator. On his way to the door, he paused. "If I walk you home when the work allows," he said, "will London live?" "London dies a little every day," she said. "It seems to enjoy the practice. We will be fine." When he left, she lifted the ring and held it to the window. The gold caught November's thin light and did not pretend to be summer. She set it down. She opened the letter. She began not to forgive, not yet, but to read the hours that would make forgiveness a reasonable craft. The letter was not long. It was relentless. Isabel read the first page standing, the second sitting, and the third with her hand braced against the table as if even paper could tilt a room. Nathaniel had dated each section as if he feared time might accuse him of embellishment. June 14th, 18th, the morning. June 15th, the ship. September, Calcutta. 2 winters later, Bombay. Year 7, the ledger turns black. He wrote plainly like a man who had learned the cost of adjectives. On the morning of their wedding, his father had confessed a ruin so complete that even silence could not have saved them. The Greyston estate, glittering to London, hungry in truth, was mortgaged past arithmetic, wages taken in club rooms where windows were shut against accuracy. Notes signed in the name of a dukedom that could still command credit, even when character could not. Worse, a clutch of creditors whose business was not merely debt, but dominion. The most predatory of them, a gentleman only in title, had sent a message: "Marry your bride, and we dine on her fortune first. Abandon her, and we permit your family to survive its shame in private." There had been another piece. It sat in the middle of the letter like a stone. The man had threatened Isabel by name, her dowry litigated in advance, her father's modest holdings targeted, her brother's commission in jeopardy. "I will not have you rescue yourself by dragging her through our mud," Nathaniel had told his father. "Pride speaks beautifully when it has run out of other work." And so the note, the missing groom, the cathedral that remembered a bell, it did not ring. The proofs lay next to the pages, copies of notes bearing his father's hand. The deed to a parcel in Bengal, traded at a price an honest man would have been ashamed to offer. A receipt from a Bombay broker for a repayment schedule that would have bankrupted a saint. Letters from a physician who documented the Duke's long, precise decline into a quiet that had nothing to do with virtue. And then the counter-evidence, ledgers that crawled from red toward black, contracts renegotiated, affidavits from the same creditors, now defanged, acknowledging settlement. They were not apologies, they were receipts. When she had finished, Isabel placed the final page atop the rest and smoothed the edges as if squaring the corners could return anything to symmetry. Across from her, Nathaniel sat with the patience of a condemned man who knows the verdict will not be hurried and must be accepted upright. "You left to save me," she said at last, the sentence cruel in its simplicity. "I left," he answered, "to save myself from choosing you and destroying you. I left because my father had already jumped and I could not ask you to learn mid-air how to fly. And for 10 years, she went on, voice steady with the effort of remaining human, you allowed me to be the lesson London told its daughters, do not trust love, it absconds before the hymn. He closed his eyes. Yes. Why did you not write? She asked, not plaintive, prosecutorial. I wrote 100 times, he said. I burned 99. The last I carried, until the ink learned my pocket. By then the news in it was too old to send. Forgive me was correct on the day of our wedding. Explain me would have been an insult by harvest. Truth is never an insult, Isabel said. It can be when it performs too late, he replied. She stood. He did not, and she marked the restraint like the first good fact of the afternoon. She crossed to the mantel, where a small brass clock counted with the honesty of things that have never had to beg for accuracy. The house on Russell Square was narrow. The light admitted itself reluctantly. In the thin beam across her hands, the ring he had brought sat obediently, and did not attempt to shine. You were not the only ruined party, she said, turning back. I was left among lions with a paper shawl and told to call it modesty. I know, he said, and he did not attempt the indecency of adding, I suffered too. The room noticed and approved. Why now? She asked. My father is dead, he said, and in his voice there was no inheritance, only aftermath. The last note is paid. The last man who could hurt you with my name has found a different prey. I am not clean. I am usable. I came to ask whether use is permitted. She studied him as she would a petition for a grant, the language, the omissions, the public good. You were a coward, she said, and when he flinched, she did not soften it. Not cruel, cowardly. You chose my dignity for me. You called it protection because your father's ruin obliged you to speak nobly in order to breathe. Yes, he said again, and the repetition had the decency of not seeking variety. I was a coward. I am willing to begin where brave men begin, with labor. Behind him, through the window, a milk boy led his cart like a general who had learned to love the common victories. Outside was a London that would never change entirely. Inside was the possibility that two people might. What would you do? She asked. If I say no, if I say, you may repair the roof and then vanish again? I would do the work and vanish, he said, spreading his hands with that small surrender she remembered from the old days, the gesture he used when confronted by truth's arithmetic. I would leave the ring at your chapel. I would require no report. And if I say yes? I will build an endowment that cannot be undone by men like my father, he said. I will sit in the back pew of your chapel until invited elsewhere. I will introduce your girls to employers who have learned to keep books that add and souls that don't subtract. I will ask nothing I have not earned. And if I say... She stopped. The word balanced on the edge of a decade, unsteady and consequential. Perhaps. He felt it like sunlight that had been told to behave. He did not reach for it. Then perhaps will be my liturgy, he said. I will practice it until it becomes a sacrament. Silence came and did not condemn them. She returned to the table and touched the ring, lightly, as if it were a small animal that must not be startled. Do you know, she said, and the voice softened into memory like a river finding its old bed. What I did the afternoon the bell did not ring? Tell me, he said, not greedy. I went to the river, she said. I took off my gloves and held the rail until the paint came away. I recited the order of service to the water. And then I promised myself that I would not let your absence be the architecture of my days. She lifted her eyes. I kept that promise. I can see it, he said, looking at her hands, the ink near the cuticle, the small nick on her finger where a girl's slate had chipped, the unjewelled steadiness of a life built to withstand gossip and weather. I have never admired anything more. Admiration should not be a bribe, it should be a recognition. She allowed it to be that. "There is one more thing," she said, and the air tightened, as if it too wished to hear. 10 years ago you asked the city to judge me a heroine for not fainting. They preferred a spectacle. I will not participate in one now. If there is to be any hearing, any forgiveness, if there is to be any ring put on any hand, it will be in daylight, without audience, and on terms that do not erase the woman who learned to run a school while London learned to yawn. "I understand," he said. "Public miracles are for men who do not intend to maintain them." The clock ticked its impartial amen. Isabel gathered the papers, placed them back into the envelope, and then, without ceremony, slid the ring toward him again, not as rejection, not as acceptance, but as the measured pause of a teacher who will not grade work until it is complete. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will come to the school, you will speak with Mrs. Larkin about the roof, you will sit in the back while we hold examinations, you will leave a list of merchants who have learned to pay women without diminishing them, and you will dine with my mother and answer her questions without rhetoric." He inclined his head. "All of this is within my competence. The last will test my courage." "She was polite to you when you did not deserve it," Isabel said. "She will be honest now that you do." He stood then because the audience had concluded, and because standing is sometimes how a man thanks a judge for her kindness in not being cruel. At the door he paused. "Isabel," he said, tasting the name as one tastes water at the end of a long sail. "The day I left I became a story told about you. I would like to become a fact in your life again." "Facts are harder to maintain than stories," she replied. "Come prepared to polish." When he had gone, she remained very still, until the street's ordinary noise stitched her back into the day. Then she gathered the cups, washed them with the brisk tenderness of women who keep things clean because some mercies must be visible, and laid out the next morning's lessons. On the mantel, the brass clock kept faithful time. On the table, the envelope lay quiet. In its wake, something in her that had been starved a long while admitted, not forgiveness, not yet, but the simple rightness of air moving through a room that had been shut too long. Outside, clouds massed over Bloomsbury, considering rain. Inside, Isabel considered weather of another kind and found to her surprise that she did not dread getting wet. The storm began like an opinion and matured into law. Afternoon darkened with a speed that made even London glance up from its business. The first rain arrived in orderly drops, then in ranks, then in a charge that made the gutters argue. At Hartwell Academy the girls had finished their recitations with gallant haste. No one wishes to pass Latin while thunder clears its throat. Isabel dismissed them early, sent them home with shawls pulled high, and promises to review verbs tomorrow if the ark had not been launched by dawn. Mrs. Larkin barred the door behind the last bonnet, and turned with the calm of women who have seen worse weather than clouds. "Roof will hold if we flatter it," she said, already fetching buckets. "We shall flatter," Isabel answered, rolling her sleeves. "And if flattery fails, bribery." They worked, as the first leaks announced themselves, 2 polite drips above the back stair, 1 aggressive percussion over the west corridor. Buckets were positioned, towels were drafted into service, a ladder objected, then complied. When lightning stitched a white seam across the windows and the thunder followed like a judge who knew precisely where to sit, the bell at the entry sounded 3 measured knocks that contained no panic and a quantity of rain. Nathaniel stood on the threshold, hat in hand, coat darkening by degrees into a map of weather. He had come with tools, not titles, a canvas satchel over his shoulder, a coil of rope, 2 tins of pitch. Mrs. Larkin told the baker the roof would need willing backs, he said, by way of permission. You took the baker's errand, Isabel replied, and the line between them recognized an old language, wit employed to keep a room from drowning. I had the advantage, he said. I know this roof's temperament. It prefers persuasion to nails. He climbed as men climb who have learned that height is not a right and balance a virtue. Isabel steadied the ladder, refusing both the impulse to demand he come down and the impulse to watch him fall. He worked with quick, sure hands, knotting, sealing, coaxing the obstinate angle near the eaves to admit defeat. When he descended, wet to the bone, and pleased in the clean way labour pleases, he grinned, unarmoured, 23 for an instant, and the room remembered a decade ago before it corrected itself. Your Grace, Mrs. Larkin said, curtsying as one does to weather when it has behaved. I'll see to the back stair, Miss Hartwell. The front classroom puddle wants a hymn. She withdrew with a tact that argued for sainthood. The door to the front classroom stood open, the map of the world curled on its rollers like a creature protesting damp. Rain drummed the panes without malice now. Once roofs learn to obey, storms relax. Isabel moved a bucket beneath a fresh insistence and turned. He had followed. The space between them gathered everything the last 10 years had not said and made a table of it. Thank you, she began, practical to the last. You'll send your bill to the roof. He shook his head. I'm here to pay it, not compose it. He set the satchel down, glanced at the window and then back at her with a steadiness that refused spectacle. Isabel, if the world ended outside this door and left the two of us to finish our argument, I would call it mercy. We have no argument, she answered. We have a record. Then let me read my line aloud, he said, and moved no closer than a man should who intends to remain honest. I loved you and chose fear. I left you to bear the price. I compounded cowardice with silence and called it protection. I have come to be accused, and if you prefer, to be punished. Punishment is theatrical, she said softly. And you were never a villain. You were a coward, and I paid for your cowardice with my youth. The sentence landed without flourish. It did not need one. While you learned to negotiate ledgers, I learned to negotiate pity. While you rebuilt fortunes, I rebuilt myself. I did it without your letters, without your hand, without any apology to warm my bones in winter. I did it because living was cheaper than dying, and because girls in this city deserve teachers who do not teach them despair. He took it like a man who has run out of evasions and found, to his astonishment, that truth hurts cleanly. Yes, he said, the word stripped of all but function. Say it again if it helps the arithmetic. She exhaled, and some part of anger, having delivered its necessary line, sat down. No, numbers once tallied need not be tallied twice. She folded her arms, not defensively, but to keep from reaching for what dignity had earned. What is it you want here, now, in this room? Not 10 years ago, not in the cathedral where bells forgot their duty. Say it without romance. I want to stay, he said. The 3 syllables did not tremble. I want to belong where you belong, not as an ornament, but as a worker. I want to hold the bucket when your hands are full, to be the person your pupils call when the hinge refuses and the footman is a myth. I want to be allowed, sometimes, to look at you without being escorted from the premises. And love? She asked, almost curious, almost kind. What shape do you imagine it takes now that we are no longer pretty? The shape of roofs, he said, surprising both of them. Kept. The shape of books repaired at the spine, the shape of a hand that has washed chalk from its fingers and still reaches, the shape of a chapel door that opens because the hour is right and not because the crowd demands it, the shape of a life in which the word "we" does not require emergency. She closed her eyes, then opened them, because some mercies must be witnessed awake. "You speak beautifully," she said. "Words are cheap until they are carried." "Then assign me weight," he replied. "I will carry it." Silence chose them and held. Rain slackened. In the corridor, a bucket adjusted its opinion by an inch. Isabel set both palms on the scarred schoolroom table, the way one does when negotiating with fate. "Kneel," she said, and did not clarify whether she meant prayer or petition. He did. He went to one knee on the wood-planked floor without melodrama, as if joints had always been meant for honesty. He did not reach for her hand. He looked up and let her see every mile, every ledger, every dawn he had spent rehearsing an apology and insulting it by delay. "If hatred relieves you," he said, "I will receive it and count it fair. If forgiveness is impossible, I will not turn saint and call you hard. If the rest of my life is labor posted outside your door, I will call it salvation." She stepped closer until the storm's reflection from the window touched both their faces. She could smell pitch and rain on him, the unadorned scent of men who have chosen work over spectacle. "I do not hate you," she said, and the admission broke something quietly and fixed something else. "I do not forgive you yet. I will not pretend a decade can be paid in one afternoon. But I believe you." Her voice gentled into the place where promises are born, and belief is the first stone in any bridge. His breath left as if the ribs had been persuaded at last to trust the lungs. He bowed his head, not to her, not to the floor, but to the fact of a future that had stopped running away. "Assign me the next thing," he said. "Stand," she answered. When he did, she searched his face and found the boy she had loved edited by weather into a man she might trust. "You will dine tonight at Hartwell Lodge. You will answer my mother plainly. Tomorrow you will negotiate with the Slater and not be taken in by his cousin's cousin. Next week you will accompany my girls to the museum and endure their questions about mummies with respect. You will show London that repair is not a rumour." "And you?" he asked, because asking had become his new craft. "I will allow the word 'we' to sit in the corner and listen," she said. "If it behaves, I may invite it to the table." A laugh, not reckless, not young, but grateful, lifted the room by a fraction. He touched the satchel as if reminded that tools prefer to be put away correctly. "There is another assignment I crave," he said, and the risk of it made his voice softer. "Do not leave this room thinking I have claimed you. I have not. I ask only for a future in which claiming is nonsense, because choosing is the only grammar tolerated." "Very well," she said. "We will practice that grammar. Daily." Lightning flashed once more, not in anger, but as if remembering an appointment. The storm, having delivered its arguments, began its retreat. Mrs. Larkin reappeared with the walk of a general surveying a field she intends to keep. She took in their faces, the absence of drama, the presence of decision, and nodded once. "Ruth's respectful," she announced. "So am I. Supper at 7, Your Grace. We are not a palace, but we are punctual." "I have coveted punctuality all my life," Nathaniel said, almost reverent. Isabel reached for the rope that controlled the map and drew the world down slowly. Continents unfurled, imperfect, biased, approximated, yet useful when corrected by better eyes. "Tomorrow," she said, half to him, half to herself. "We redraw." He hesitated at the doorway, then turned back, the rain behind him now only a rumour. "I have carried something 10 years, he said, hand moving to the inside pocket where the ring had lived. "Not to press it on you, to prove to myself that some vows resist rust." "Bring it," she said, stopping him with a look before the velvet appeared. "Not to give, to show. Tomorrow, when the sky is honest." He bowed. "A debtor's bow, a lover's bow, a man's bow." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she returned. He left to make himself presentable for a mother's cross-examination. Isabel stood alone a moment longer in the schoolroom that had taught her to prefer work over legend. She touched the table, the rope, the bucket, then smoothed her skirt and laughed once, quiet, relieved, shocked by Hope's ordinary face. Beyond the Paynes, the last of the storm moved off toward other parishes who would also need to remember how to hold. The academy exhaled. In the lane, girls' voices rose as they skipped puddles on their way home, the city's best choir rehearsing a future that would belong, if anyone had sense, to them. Dawn arrived like a careful servant, drawing back the veil of night an inch at a time so no one would be startled. The storm had spent itself. Puddles held small portraits of the sky. Gutters exhaled. At Hartwell Lodge the kitchen fire woke before the house did, and the day, pleased to find itself in good hands, began to behave. Isabel stood in the garden with a cup she had not yet sipped, watching a blackbird conduct the hedgerow. The air smelled rinsed, wet earth, rose leaves, the faint iron of yesterday's nails. She felt the newness of the morning resist drama and invite accuracy. The night had granted her something rarer than resolution, the right to proceed. Inside, her mother laid out breakfast with the deliberate mercy of women who know meals can mend what sermons cannot. When the clock marked 8, wheels sounded on the lane, measured, unhurried. Mrs. Hartwell did not glance at her daughter. She adjusted a knife so it sat perfectly parallel to its plate. "We are at home," she said quietly, which is how English mothers announce both policy and love. Nathaniel entered the morning room, hat in hand, hair still damp from a walk taken without theatrics. He greeted Mrs. Hartwell with a bow that remembered its history. He greeted Isabel with the exact inclination one gives a person upon whom one's future relies. The ring was not visible. He sat when asked, declined jam when pressed, and answered questions with the plainness of a man who has spent his eloquence on ledgers and prayers. "Your father?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, neither sympathetic nor cruel. "Buried," he said, and did not embellish. "The debt's beside him." "And your habits?" "Under supervision," he answered, and permitted a smile. "Hers." "Good," said Mrs. Hartwell, who had acquired a theology of the domestic over years of practice. "We are not hiring a miracle, Your Grace. We are hiring repair." "We?" Isabel said, amused despite the drumbeat in her ribs. "We," her mother repeated. "Your girls require roofs and readers. Your heart requires something steadier than resentment to carry." She folded her napkin. "I have decided to forgive him later. For now, we will judge him by work." Nathaniel bowed again, eyes bright with the particular gratitude men wear when welcomed into a world governed by useful women. He stood. "There is another appointment I must keep," he said to Isabel. "May I meet you at the chapel in an hour?" "An hour?" she agreed. When he had gone, Mrs. Hartwell refilled her daughter's cup and looked out at the cleaned garden. "You stood upright when they preferred collapse," she said. "Do not bend now out of habit. If you choose him, choose in daylight, and if you refuse him, refuse without performance. It is the performance that exhausts." "Mother," Isabel asked, "do you believe in second bell rings?" "I believe in clocks," Mrs. Hartwell replied. and in women who decide what hours mean. The chapel by the river had been washed by the storm. Its stone, usually stern, wore a softness usually reserved for June brides and October saints. Isabel arrived early and sat in her usual pew, the last, where teachers sit because they have learned to see the back of things as clearly as the front. She folded her hands not to appear devout, but to keep from touching the place at her throat where a key no longer hung. She had put the box away, she had put the decade where it belonged, on a shelf marked, "Do not burn. Consult when necessary." Nathaniel entered without flourish, as if chapel doors preferred to open for humility. He paused at the font, as men do when reminded that water keeps better records than paper, and then came to stand at the end of her pew, waiting for invitation. She nodded. He took the space beside her and let stillness do its first good work. "I have brought it," he said at last, drawing from his waistcoat the small, familiar circle. He did not open his palm. He held it as one holds a truth, visible but not imposed. "It has learned patience." "So have we," Isabel said. He turned the ring once, twice. "I'm not asking you to wear it," he said. "I'm asking to be the sort of man who may one day deserve to ask." She looked at his face and saw, not youth returned, but youth redeemed. The laughter line that had forgotten vanity, the tiredness that did not apologize for being evidence of effort, the mouth that had learned to rest when silence was the correct answer. "I do not marry apologies," she said gently. "I marry practice." "Then write me a syllabus," he replied. "I've always been a poor student without one." She took a breath that did not hurt. "You will fund the endowment, properly, with conditions that prevent clever men from stealing from girls. You will put the school's charter under the same roof as your own, so that when your dukedom catches cold, my girls do not shiver. You will sit on our examinations and not speak unless spoken to. You will stand between my pupils and any man who tries to reduce them to decor. You will walk with me on Sundays and say nothing untrue. And you will not ask me to forgive you on a timetable that satisfies society." "Agreed," he said, as if asked to carry buckets. "And you?" "I will not punish you for failing to be a god," Isabel answered. "I will notice the work done. I will correct you when your pride borrows your pen. I will ask for help before the roof falls. I will write your name on the ledger labeled "Proved Useful" and leave it there until you insist on promotion." He laughed softly then, and the sound did not jar the chapel. It polished it. "One more condition," he said, the risk of it making his voice almost boyish. "When I fail, and I will, you will allow me to make repair where I failed, not elsewhere. I do not wish to purchase virtue in one corner while vice collects interest in another." "You have learned accounting," she said, pleased. "I have learned penance is bad economics," he returned. They stood. She nodded toward the chancel. "Walk?" They moved up the aisle together, not as penitent and judge, not as legend and ghost, but as two people who had decided to live with doors open. At the rail they stopped. The bell rope hung quiet as a question. He set the ring on the wood, not an offering, not a demand, a fact. She laid her fingers beside it. For a moment neither touched either. 10 years ago, he said, I wanted angels to intervene. 10 years ago, she said, I wanted a crowd to disappear. Today, he said, I want only to be accurate. Today, she said, I want only to be kind. She lifted the ring, not to her hand, but to the light. The gold caught the winter sun and remembered June without pretending it was June. She set it back, halfway between them, exactly equidistant from history and hope. Not yet, she said, not yet. he agreed. They turned and walked out into a world that had decided to be ordinary. The river kept its vow, the path remembered how to be a path. They said very little because sentences can bruise a morning. At the lodge gate, a small pair of boots scudded through a puddle. One of her pupils, bonnet askew, textbook hugged like treasure. "Miss Hartwell," the girl shouted, "the roof didn't leak last night." "No," Isabel called back, "it learned better manners." The child noticed Nathaniel and made the frank appraisal children deliver without knives. "Are you the Duke who was late?" she asked. "I am," he said. "I am practicing punctuality." "Good," she said, satisfied. "Miss Hartwell likes facts on time." When the girl had gone, they looked at each other and, for the first time in 10 years, smiled without ache. "She will be a minister," Nathaniel said. "She will be a minister of anything she wishes," Isabel replied. They reached the small gate in the hedge where the path narrowed to admit only one person at a time. He stepped back. "After you," he said. "No," she answered, and held the gate so they could pass together. At the lodge, Mrs. Hartwell waited with her needlework and a dignity that never advertised itself. She rose, examined their faces, and decided the day could be trusted. "Supper at 6, she said. "Afterward, you will both write to the committee about the endowment. If you miss a comma, I shall be merciless." "We will be punctual and grammatical," Nathaniel said. "Try being useful," she replied, and returned to her chair. Evening prepared itself without pageantry. Nathaniel walked back to the city to bully a slater and charm a solicitor. Isabel sat at her desk and wrote 2 letters, one accepting a shipment of readers, one refusing a newspaper interview. Before she sealed the second, she added a postscript: "The bell will ring if it rings, when work has been done." At dusk he returned, coat smelling of pitch and wind, hair arguing politely with the day. He held up a signed contract for the roof and a receipt for the first transfer to the endowment. "Facts," he said simply. She opened the ledger and wrote his name. Not in the column for miracles, in the column that matters. They ate with Mrs. Hartwell, who declared the potatoes honest and the man not intolerable. After, in the garden, where the air kept a little of the storm for flavour, he took from his waistcoat the ring once more. "May I carry it for now?" she asked. "Please," he said, relief visible as light. She set it in a small pouch with the school keys. "It will live with the locks," she said. "Appropriate," he murmured. They stood without touching, listening to the house settle. Somewhere in the lane girls laughed, unchecked. The world was not redeemed, it was repairable. Isabel looked at him and saw not the boy who failed her, but the man who had returned with the correct tools. She offered her hand. He took it, not to claim, only to steady. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he answered. Behind them the chapel kept its door unlocked. Above them, the sky, having been dramatic yesterday, chose tonight to be clear. And somewhere between the river's patient sentence and the bell's unspent note, a life the city had misnamed ended, and a quieter one began, with grammar they both intended to keep,